These two homes are in the same flood zone, but their flood risks are totally different. If a house was built before 2019 in Houston, then you should pay more attention, and your agent may not know this. Hello my friends, welcome to my Harmony Garden. This is a special episode without any gardening or music stuff. I'm gonna share my findings about flood risks when buying a house in Houston, including several critical problems that most other channels do not talk about. And I will reveal the ultimate solution at the end of the video, so stay tuned. My company is relocating from New Jersey to Houston. In my home search, I found that the flood considerations in Houston is a lot more complicated than where I live now. And I am very risk averse to flooding. So I did a lot of learning and researching, including reaching out to the local government and home developers for more information. But before I share the insider scoop, I would like to start with the most important basic concepts. But if you already understand all of these, then you can hover over the progress bar below to click skip to the next section to see my interesting findings. The flood map is our best friend for a good basic understanding of the flood risk of a home. And you may hear people talk about different variants of the flood map. But really, all the variants out there are just taking the FEMA data and visualize them a little bit differently. The FEMA map was developed by the US government to help the public better understand the flood risk of different places, and the insurance companies also use it to determine the insurance premium of a house. First of all, how do we access it? There are three main options. The first one is, of course, the official FEMA website. However, this website is not user-friendly. It takes a long time for the data to load when you play with it, like zooming in or zooming out or moving around, and sometimes the data just don't show up. The second option is har.com. The flood map there uses the same FEMA data but has a much better user interface. However, it's only available to your real estate agent. The third option, which I would highly recommend, is the county-level flood map. For example, a lot of the Houston area is in Harris County, and the county has their flood map for public use. Same FEMA data, but a lot smoother to use. Likewise, the Montgomery County has a similar map in case you want to look at the Spring area, for example. I'll put the links in the description below. How do we read the flood map? We just follow the colors. For example, in this Harris County flood map, we have the dark blue zone, which is the floodway, but homes are not built there. The orange only exists near the coast. So for most areas, there are three important colors: the blue, the green, and the transparent, the unshaded, which correspond to three important concepts. Before I explain the details, you can simply view them as high risk, moderate risk, and low risk. Now let's see what they actually mean. The blue zone is called the 100-year floodplain, which on the FEMA map is noted with letter A or A something. If a house is located in the 100-year floodplain, it means that there is a 1% chance that you will see a flood in any given year, which may not sound very risky, but if you live in that house, say for 30 years, then there's a 26% probability that your house will be flooded based on this simple probability math. So in general, people want to avoid it. This is a good place to introduce another important concept, which you may already know, and that is elevation, which is the height of a place raised above sea level, which is quite simple. But there's another concept that you need to know on top of that, the base flood elevation, which is the elevation at which there is a 1% chance of flooding in a year, which points to exactly the same thing as the 100-year floodplain, and it's often used as a reference. So you may hear people say, this house is 5 feet above the base flood elevation. Now, here's an exercise question to confirm your understanding. If these two houses have the same elevation, same height above the sea level, then do they have the same flood risk? The answer is no, because the flood risk of a location depends not only on the elevation, but also its surrounding environment. Like, is there a retention pond in the community to provide as a buffer? Is there a creek nearby? Is there a good drainage system in the neighborhood? All of those are going to matter, and an expert engineer would need to consider all of those to estimate the flood risk of a place. So do not rely on elevation maps. Now, what about a modified version of this exercise? If these two houses are both 5 feet above the base flood elevation, then do they have about the same flood risk? Now the answer is yes, because the base flood elevation is a useful reference because it already considers a lot of the surrounding environment. It's the elevation corresponding to a 1% chance of flooding in a particular location. So now, when you say your place is X feet above that 1% risk elevation, it is meaningful. The next concept is the 500-year floodplain, which on the FEMA map is noted as X shaded. Same concept as the 100-year floodplain, except that the 500-year floodplain represents a 0.2% chance of flooding annually. So if you live there for 30 years, then there's a 6% chance that you will experience flooding. It's more acceptable, but still not desirable, right? Especially if you consider potentially higher flood risks in the future. Finally, we have zones outside of the floodplains, which is transparent without any color. On the FEMA map, they are called the X unshaded zone. They are low-risk areas, although not risk-free. Actually, many places in Zone X unshaded also got flooded during Hurricane Harvey back in 2017, which caused the worst flooding in Houston's history. That's how to read the flood map, which seems straightforward. But if you look closely, same flood zone, but very different risks. Look at these two example houses. They are in the same master plan community with the same developer. They are also in the same flood zone. Both are outside of the floodplains. But if we check their elevation certificates, which are something you can ask for from the sellers, then we will see a big difference between their effective elevations above the floodplains. This one is 8 feet above the base flood elevation, aka the 100-year floodplain, whereas this other one is only 3 feet above. So if I buy this house, then I'm getting 5 feet more buffer from the base flood compared with this other house. This will be important for you, especially if you believe that the flood risk is going to be higher in the future. If you don't understand this comparison, please go back to the previous section. This observation was really confusing to me in the beginning because this whole area is quite flat. So it appears that the builders were using different building elevation standards, but in fact, these two houses had the same developer. They're in the same community. I reached out to the developer and the local government, but I never heard back, so I did my own research. That's when I came across this Houston Code of Ordinances document, and in Chapter 19 of the current version dated September 10th, 2024, it says that a house has to be elevated at least 2 feet above the 500-year floodplain. However, when I checked the versions before June 2018, it said 18 inches, which is 1.5 feet, above the 100-year floodplain. The standards have changed. With that in mind, now let's revisit these two houses. According to their elevation certificate, these are their base flood elevations, and these are their first floor elevations. So with a simple math, we see that their effective elevations above the 100-year floodplain, the base flood elevation, that is a 5 feet difference. Both houses met the building requirements when they were built, this one in 2024 and the other one in 2018, which was indeed more than 1.5 feet above the base flood elevation. It was actually 3 feet instead of 1 foot above. They went above and beyond the requirement because good developers plan for the future. However, it was a lower requirement to start with. The new standard uses a more risk-averse baseline, which is the 500-year floodplain, to do flood risk management. But it's still possible that some houses built in 2019 followed the old standard if the construction happened before the new code went into effect. So the key takeaway here is 2019 is a critical year. Check the elevation certificate if you're buying a house that was built before then to better evaluate the flood risk instead of just looking at the flood map. In the flood zone can be better than outside. Now here's another interesting finding. In this new example, we're going to keep this house on the right, which is outside the flood zone, but switch the house on the left to another one that sits in the 100-year floodplain in this blue area. So now we should expect to see this one to have a higher elevation above the floodplains than the other one, right? Because that's the purpose of the flood map. But when we actually check their elevation certificates, we see the opposite. This house in the flood zone, according to the FEMA map, is actually 7 feet above the base flood, whereas this other house, shown as outside the flood zone on the FEMA map, is only 3 feet above the base flood. Even the street next to this house has a higher elevation above the base flood than the floor of this other house. So how can a house sitting in the flood zone be better than sitting outside? This is because the flood map falls behind reality when it comes to new construction homes. Because after the developer purchases a piece of land, they are required to effectively elevate it out of the floodplain through adding dirt, retention ponds, drainage systems, and so on. Again, for new construction homes today, the developers are required to elevate a home at least 2 feet above the 500-year floodplain. And when the site is ready, the developers would submit a conditional letter of map revision to the government to update the FEMA map. And when that is approved, the flood zone on the map will actually change. So, although you see all these uncolored areas now outside the floodplain, some of them used to be blue actually in previous versions of the map. And moving into the future updated versions, we should expect some blue areas here to become uncolored or unshaded. I also got confirmation about my understanding from the developer. They elevate all new construction homes outside of the floodplain. As a testimonial to their statement, during Hurricane Harvey, the largest flooding event in Houston, not a single house in this community was flooded, according to what their CEO said in this interview. So personally, I would prefer this house over the other when it comes to flood risk, because although this one is currently in the blue zone, its effective elevation above the floodplains is higher. And by the way, if you want to check whether a house was flooded during Hurricane Harvey, here is a useful map to see the before and after of the flood. Impact on flood insurance. Depending on which flood zone a house is in, the annual insurance premium can be different by a few $100s to over $1,000. And here's a summary of the main scenarios. If a house is in Zone X unshaded, meaning outside the flood zone, then flood insurance is optional, and you can expect to pay $300 to $500 per year on average. If a house is in Zone X shaded, which means the 500-year floodplain, then the flood insurance is still optional, but it's a few $100s more expensive than the previous case. If a house is in Zone A, which is the 100-year floodplain, then your mortgage lender will require you to carry flood insurance, which will be an additional hundreds of dollars or over $1,000 more expensive than the previous case. And then there are two special cases. Case number one, if a house is in the flood zone, but at the same time it is a new construction home, then the builder will likely cover that additional cost. In the past, they would cover your insurance until the FEMA map is revised so that the house does not appear in the flood zone anymore, because they wouldn't want the buyers to have any concerns when deciding to buy a house. And back then, people were not familiar with this map revision process, but over time, it's become a more standard thing. So now in the contract, they would just cover your additional flood insurance cost for a couple of years, and most likely just 1 year, because they think that would be enough time for the government to revise the map. Special case number two, if a house appears in the flood zone on the FEMA map, but has an elevation certificate showing that it's elevated above the floodplains, then your insurance provider might give you a cost reduction. However, the reduction would be minimal. If your entire neighborhood is still in the flood zone, even if your own house is not, the insurance company does not like that. So if you are sensitive to flood insurance cost, then what this means to you is you do not want to build a new house in an old neighborhood that is currently in the flood zone. You would want a new house in a new neighborhood, preferably a master plan community. Because even if the neighborhood is currently in the floodplain, the developers would elevate the entire community out of it. And that's what the insurance companies would like to see. What are some other things worth mentioning? Some websites, such as Redfin, show you the flood score or flood factor. That is not the FEMA rating based on current measurements and estimates. The flood factor is based on mathematical modeling to make future projections. I played with it, it's fun, but I do not use it because currently the model does not seem to include all the engineering factors such as drainage system, retention ponds, and construction site elevation. So personally, I do not think it's realistic enough yet. Also worth mentioning, you can easily check the FEMA flood zone of a resale house on Redfin when you go to the climate risk section, click open it, and check it right here. Typically, you would want X unshaded, but be aware of the important exceptions that we've just talked about. Also, be extra careful if you're checking a new home sold by a builder because their admins often mess up the location. For example, this one appears here on the map, and the flood zone query is based on that, which says Zone X unshaded, not in the flood zone. But actually, this house is located here if you check the street name, And then you will see that it is in zone AE, which is the flood zone. So totally mismatched information there. So always double check when you're dealing with a new construction home. As you can see, navigating the flood issues is quite complicated. But at the end of the day, the ultimate solution is check the elevation certificate, especially that difference between a home's elevation and the 100-year and 500-year floodplains. If for some reason that certificate is not available for a house built before 2019, then I would just say be extra careful. Thanks for watching.